Greetings, ladies and gentlefish, and today I thought we'd do something a little bit different, and something that allows me to wax lyrical about three of my favourite things. Science, history, and planes. I'm a bit of an aircraft nerd, so today we are going to talk about supercruising and what the hell it is. And the reason for that is, well, any of you who might pay a vague attention to some military-related things might have seen pictures of this thing. This is the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon. It's China's shiny, new, advanced, 5th generation stealth fighter, and it's making a little bit of a splash, or has made a little bit of a splash. And one of the things it is apparently capable of doing is supercruising. So, I thought today might be an interesting opportunity to have a look at what that means, what some of the implications are, the capability that would give this machine, I suppose, and also maybe consider some of the downsides, because it's not all sunshine and rainbows. So without further ado, we're going to have a look at supercruising. But in order to do that, we're going to have a look at how a jet engine works, and in order to do that, we're going to do a little bit of basic physics. So when I was at school, one of my chemistry teachers had this little homemade device that he used to use to fire a plastic cap at people if they dared to fall asleep. Welcome to education in the early 2000s. Now, the irony being, of course, that he was actually a pretty good teacher and people weren't in the habit of falling asleep, apart from Bailey. But that guy could sleep through a thrash metal concert, so make of that what you will. Anyway, this device consisted of an old film canister, you know, that used to have films in for cameras. I've got a picture of one there for you. And in the canister was a little bit of some sort of fuel. I believe he tended to use an alcohol, probably ethanol. It would evaporate nicely. And there was a small spark plug or something similar with a little remote trigger. So the spark would go off, it would ignite the fuel, and it would fire this little cap across the room. But how did it actually work? So, this is where we're going to do a little bit of physics. I have written the only equation you're going to see throughout the entirety of this video. Pressure times volume equals some constant times temperature. So what this is essentially known as the ideal gas law. You may also have heard of Charles's law, Boyle's law, and some others. These all fold into this ideal gas law. And what this does is relate the pressure, volume and temperature of a gas all together in one nice neat little equation. So for our purposes, what it means in practice is if you take an object full of a gas, and let's remember in this case this little film canister is full of air, then that must mean that that gas is occupying a fixed volume because it is stuck inside the canister. So in this case, volume doesn't change. Arc C, which is a constant, also doesn't change, so the only parameters that can vary are pressure and temperature. Now, if you set fire to a load of propellant, a load of fuel, I should say, that's going to make the temperature of the air rapidly increase. Well, if the volume doesn't change, and C is a constant, and the temperature changes, then in order for that equation to still hold true, that must mean the pressure of the gas also changes. So if you rapidly increase the temperature of a gas in a confined volume, you also rapidly increase the pressure that that gas exerts on its container. And in this particular case, if that pressure gets high enough, it exerts a sufficient force upon the cap of the film canister to launch it across the room. Now, those of you who've worked in any sort of engineering field might also be aware, of course, or many of you may have realised, that this also applies in a lot of other situations. So if you have, I don't know, a pipe and it's got a gas in it and you rapidly heat it up, there's a reasonable chance, if that gas is confined, that it could rupture the pipe. It could explode, essentially. So that can become a little bit of a problem. But that's how my chemistry teacher's old toy worked. And, I say toy, device for waking people up. And a car engine works in much the same way. you light the fuel with a spark. But in this case, instead of firing a little plastic cap across the room, that rapid increase in pressure pushes against a piston. And that's essentially how an internal combustion engine works. And believe it or not, a jet engine works in much the same way. This is a very simplified diagram of a jet engine. And your air goes in at one end, in this case the left-hand side, and passes into an appropriately named combustion chamber. You squirt some fuel into the combustion chamber. You have some method for making that fuel ignite. The temperature of the air rapidly increases, ergo so does the pressure. But this time you haven't capped the container. So rather than the engine, the vessel exploding, the air is just forced out of the back of the engine at quite high speed, and that generates what you refer to as your thrust for your jet engine. And for anyone who's really bored, go and look up Newton's laws of motion, and of course if you're exerting a force on the air must be exerting a force on you, and thus if your exhaust is going out the back of your engine, your aircraft goes forwards. That is, in essence, how a jet engine works. Now, there are a whole bunch of additional little bits you can put on. You can put a fan on, you can put a compressor. There's a whole range of different types of jet engines, some of which do away with some of those bits. Ramjets are surprisingly simple, for example. But, in essence, that is how a jet engine works. And it allows you to go faster than by having, say, an engine with a bunch of pistons connected to a propeller. So, as the Second World War was drawing to a close, you ended up seeing a couple of jet-powered aircraft turn up, things like the ME-262 and the Gloucester Meteor. But all of those aircraft had a little bit of a problem, and indeed the ones that were to follow in the immediate post-war era. It became apparent that you could now go faster, which was good, but as you started approaching the speed of sound, you started experiencing a lot of turbulence. And this region, as you approach the speed of sound, started being referred to as the transonic region. So transonic region is referring to that range of speeds between Mach 0.8 and Mach 1.2. For anybody who doesn't know, the Mach scale is a way of quantifying speed in terms of the local speed of sound within that medium, typically the air. So Mach 1 would be the speed of sound, which at standard conditions at sea level would be 330 meters per second. Feel free to convert that into something more useful for you if you like other units. So Mach 0.8 is 80% of the speed of sound, or 0.8 of the speed of sound. Mach 1.2 is 1.2 times the speed of sound. So that's the region that is encompassing the speed of sound. And you get a lot of turbulence around there. Now, they didn't necessarily know at the time, but we know now, the wonders of the benefit of hindsight. If you can push through that turbulence and you can make your aircraft go fast enough to get through that region, you get into the supersonic range and a lot of that turbulence falls away. Hurrah! Isn't that fantastic? But the problem that people were having at the time was, well, how do you do that? We need to have more power in order to make our planes go faster, and at the time this was predominantly a problem for military aircraft, as they were the ones, generally speaking, trying to go that fast. So you've, broadly speaking, got a couple of different options with regard to trying to get more power out of your little jet engine. Option 1, you could make the jet engine larger. If you make the jet engine larger, that means you can combust, you can burn more fuel at once, and so you can push more air out the back of it. And you can draw more air in through the front in order to push out the back. And if you can push more air out the back of it, without risking blowing your engine up, of course, then you get more thrust. If you've got more thrust, your plane will go faster. Hurrah! So you could have a larger engine. You could also have more engines, and you could strap more engines to your plane, and there might be another hidden option, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And you'll see from the pictures I've got over on the right-hand side of some post-war transonic planes. Generally speaking, we're talking about single-engined aircraft, and basically, in most cases, or in many cases, the engine runs the length of the plane, and then some poor schmuck is sitting on the top. So we've got an F-86 Sabre at the top, a MiG-17 in the middle, and a Hawker Hunter at the bottom. I know the Hawker Hunter looks like it's got 2 engines. If you look at the front of the wings, it's got 2 air intakes, 1 in each wing, but that actually goes into a single engine. Now, the problem with either having a larger engine or having more engines is that it makes your plane bigger and heavier. And if you're building a fighter jet, for instance, you don't really want your aircraft to be any bigger than absolutely necessary. Remember, this is still very much the sort of time period where F-86 Sabres are flying around and shooting MiG-15s or MiG-17s with 50 cal machine guns or 20mm cannons. These are still gunfighters at the end of the day. And even if they weren't gunfighters and they were using short-range air-to-air missiles, as would become apparent with time, you still want some agility on your plane. You don't want to be a big, slow, well, not slow, but a big, lumbering target. So this does pose a little bit of a problem. Now, there is a third option, as I said, and that is using an afterburner, sometimes referred to as a reheat. So the idea with an afterburner is that you take your engine, and instead of making the, say, combustion chamber of the engine bigger, you just take your engine and you squirt fuel into the hot exhaust that comes out the back. That fuel ignites and generates some extra thrust, importantly without requiring a massively large engine to achieve that. This is one of the coolest pictures I could find for afterburners. This is on a Tu-22, I think. Whatever. It's actually quite a big plane, but regardless, doesn't matter what it is for these purposes. The engine goes from a relatively idle state in the first image, and by the time you get to the image on the far right-hand side, the afterburner is in full swing. This is what gives the back of jet aircraft that glow, especially when we're talking fighter jets that you might have seen. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The downside of this is that it burns up your fuel very, very quickly. And so if you're going to use an afterburner, generally speaking, you're only going to use it for a limited period of time. Maybe you're going to use it to help you take off. Maybe you're going to use it to give yourself a short snap of speed for a limited period of time, but you're not planning to maintain that indefinitely. Because if you were able to maintain supersonic speed without using an afterburner, so you were to basically go with bigger engines or more of them or something like that, then you would be supercruising. Now, I've decided to word my own definition up there. Most definitions of supercruising are along similar lines. Some people leave off the last bit, but I think it's important. So, we're using the definition here, that is, sustaining supersonic flight while carrying a typical payload and without the use of afterburners. So, we're not using afterburners here because, again, they can only be used for a limited period of time and they burn up fuel, or at least we're not having to use afterburners in order to attain supersonic flight. And we want to be carrying a typical payload because otherwise what's the use of it? Sure, you can build a plane that might be able to go supersonic without using an afterburner, but if it can't carry people or can't carry many people or can't carry anything useful, then kind of what's the point? So this is what we mean by supercruising. And we can't really talk about supercruising and supersonic flight without talking about one of the most gorgeous planes ever designed. My God, just look at that. That is, of course, the Concorde. Now, I could have talked about the Tupolev 144 here, but that was a dismal failure. So I'm not. This is Concorde, obviously. And it is technically a passenger aircraft. Well, it is a passenger aircraft, no technically about it. And it can supercruise. It has got 4 rather powerful engines strapped below the wings, and it is shaped like a dart. In fact, there's a fun little story about this thing. This is apparently, so the story goes, this is the only image of the Concorde that exists while it is flying supersonically, while it is supercruising. The reason being that when it's going quite fast, and the Concorde was a very fast plane, it's quite difficult to go up to it and take a picture of it. And apparently this picture was orchestrated by taking a Royal Air Force Tornado jet, stripping it down, so it wasn't carrying missiles and stuff, and telling it exactly where Concorde would be and going, off you hop, you've only got a few minutes. Because otherwise Concorde's going to have left. And apparently the Concorde still had to slow down in order for the picture to be taken. And then once the picture was taken and the tornado is struggling to maintain speed, Concorde just accelerates away off into the distance. It's a monumental feat of engineering. I mentioned the Soviet Tupolev 144 was a very similar aircraft. Technically, I believe the Tupolev had its first flight first, but the Tupolev was just a disaster. It never really became commercially viable, and indeed Concorde itself, whilst it did serve for many years, was retired in the early 2000s, and whilst nominally the reasons given were on safety grounds, the reality was that flying on this thing was very expensive. Sure, you could go across the Atlantic in just a few hours. It was very impressive, but you paid an astronomical sum of money to do so. This was an expensive plane to build, an expensive plane to maintain, an expensive plane to fly on, and so on and so forth. And really, it was only there for the rich, shall we say. So this is one approach, and you essentially take a large dart, put powerful engines on it, and watch your plane go supercruise. Now, you can kind of do that a little bit with a jetliner, but if you've got a military application, you're a little more interested, especially if you're looking to make a jet fighter. Which brings us on to the English Electric Lightning, one of my favourite aircraft of all time, and no, do not adjust your set or rotate your head. Yes, that plane is flying vertically. The English Electric Lightning was designed to do one thing and one thing only. It was designed to climb monumentally quickly and go like stink. It's a well-known aircraft for its party trick, which was travelling supersonically in vertical flight, which is bonkers. Now, the picture you've got there, I just wanted to show the picture of the thing going straight up. That's obviously from this aircraft's time in the Saudi Air Force. And yeah, I just love the plane. It's great. However, it is an excellent example of the sort of design compromises that you make in order to create a supercruising aircraft. So we mentioned with Concorde, it was expensive, wasn't very economical, had a relatively small passenger capacity by the standards of passenger aircraft. And if we have a look at the English Electric Lightning there, you can see some other problems. Remembering this thing was around in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. It didn't have radar. It carried a very limited payload of 2 cannon and 2 early generation short-range air-to-air missiles. In fact, there was even a variant that did away with the cannon entirely because who cares? It was designed to take off, climb incredibly quickly, intercept Soviet bombers, and then get back down. It would be guided to its target by ground-based radar site or an AWACS or something. It was not designed to find the target itself with its own radar. It was just designed to get there. It is about as close as military aircraft come to just being a missile. If you have a look at it, it is 2 engines running the entire length of the plane, wings highly swept back, and someone sitting on top. All other design considerations that don't revolve around this thing moving like stink have just been left by the wayside. The payload is terrible. And this is even more apparent when we make a direct compromise between the English Electric Lightning here and another aircraft that was developed and designed and in operation in a very similar time period, the F-4 Phantom, which is on the left here. Now, the Phantom, of course, was an American design, and the Phantom just does pretty much everything better. It can carry a radar. It has 2 crew instead of 1, which reduces the workload on that 1 crew member. It carries a heavier payload. It can carry more of payload. It can be used to fulfill a greater range of roles. It has been used in the ground attack role, reconnaissance role, air-to-air role. The list goes on. The Phantom is better in every single respect except for one, and that is sheer raw speed. And that is kind of the problem. If you are designing, this was certainly at the time, in sort of the 1960s, if you are designing a plane to supercruise, you make so many compromises in the rest of your design that you have to start asking yourself whether it was worth it. And I think the most interesting way of demonstrating that is by saying that despite the fact that these two planes were designed at basically the same time, and by comparably skilled designers, etc., the English Electric Lightning was replaced in Royal Air Force service by the F-4 Phantom. Just like the English Electric Lightning wasn't a bad plane, it did what it was designed to do exceptionally well, but the F-4 Phantom was just much more flexible and was a better all-round aircraft. Again, the Lightning was an astonishing feat of engineering, but really the Phantom is a better plane, a better fighter plane, a better military plane. Well, that's the British response to military supercruising aircraft. What about the Americans and the Russians? Well, I should say, and the Soviets. Did they do anything about it at the time period? Well, that picture kind of shouts the answer, doesn't it? This is the SR-71 Blackbird. It is, even today, the fastest air-breathing aircraft. And by air-breathing, I basically mean it didn't have rockets. So the American approach, instead of trying to build a supercruising fighter, because obviously limited payload, they built a supercruising reconnaissance plane. Because if the plane can go fast enough, that makes it all but impossible to intercept. Now, the SR-71 is big, and it has a lot of problems, and again, there are a lot of compromises in the design process in order to achieve a plane that is capable of going as quick as the SR-71, which has a top speed, I believe, in excess of Mach 3, which is ridiculous. And there are a lot of compromises that go into that. So, for example, the panels used to build this, the metal panels used to build it, don't fit together properly. The reason they don't fit together properly is that when you are travelling that fast, the metal panels are going to heat up and they will expand. So this thing was intentionally designed such that when it was on the ground, the metal panels had a gap between them so that when it was travelling very quickly and those panels heated up and expanded, they would expand into the gap and therefore fill the gap. What that meant is that when it was on the ground and in storage, the SR-71 leaked. Just to give you an example. So that's the American response. The SR-71 is a very strange plane. Well, what about the Soviets? Well, they developed the MiG-25 and the MiG-31, its successor. And I'm showing the MiG-31 here. Now, this aircraft often gets mentioned in the same breath as things like the SR-71 because, frankly, this is a big, brutal fighter jet that is designed to be able to intercept stuff like the SR-71. This thing is enormous. For the sake of comparison, the English Electric Lightning clocks in at around 14 tons. This thing is not too far off double that in weight. This is a large aircraft that you can see coming from a mile off. This thing is not stealthy at all, which will be important in a moment. However, it does carry a very respectable payload, a very heavy payload, and can go very, very, very quickly. So have the Russians cracked the supercruise issue for fighter jets in the MiG-25/MiG-31? No, because this thing doesn't actually supercruise. This thing is designed to have its afterburners running for a long time, so a lot of that large plane is full of engine and fuel tank. This thing chucks in the afterburners and keeps them going in order to go quickly. If the afterburners are off, it goes subsonic like every other schmuck out there. Not necessarily a bad solution, but a very Soviet solution to the problem, shall we say. Like I say, however, this thing is not very stealthy. It is a large aircraft, and therefore it is easy to see coming, something you can't say for what we've got coming next. Now, if we move on to the modern day and age, we are looking at aircraft where the engineering has developed to the point that you can legitimately have a supercruising, multi-role fighter. We don't really use dedicated bombers much these days. A multi-role plane that can do a bit of everything tends to be more the flavour of the period. But in order to make that aircraft supercruise, there are still engineering challenges, and so there's quite a limited list that can do it. So we've got the Saab Gripen, Swedish. We've got the French Dassault Rafale. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it. We've got the Eurofighter. We've got the F-22. We've got the J-20 here, and you might notice that these tend to be machines developed by well-known military powers, essentially. You might try and argue that Sweden is less prominent as a military power than, say, France or the United States or Germany. I would argue you should have a look at the Swedish arms manufacturing industry. For a country with a population of 5 to 10 million, something like that, I can't remember the exact numbers, but a fairly modest population, Sweden hits well above its weight in terms of arms manufacture. Now, the list I've got there are two particular machines that stand out. Those bottom two, the F-22 and the J-20, because on that list they are also the only 5th generation stealth fighters. The others there are 4th generation fighter jets, still very competent. No, I'm not trying to say they're not. But the bottom two are in a class of their own, frankly. And this means that China's J-20 there has managed to enter a very select and elite group. They have produced a fighter, A, capable of supercruising, which is a notable achievement in and of itself, and B, capable of using stealth technology. Combine those two things together and, well, there's only one other aircraft really in the world that competes. That's the F-22. We can start arguing the case in a moment about another one, but we'll get onto that into a second. So this is a very impressive engineering feat by the Chinese to develop the J-20. However, is it all sunshine and rainbows? Let's compare the 4 known 5th generation stealth fighters. On the left, we've got the Sukhoi Su-57 from Russia. Second place, we've got the Lockheed Martin F-22, the Raptor. Then we've got the Lockheed Martin F-35B, sometimes called the Lightning. And then we've got the Chengdu J-20. Now, of these 4 planes, all of them are apparently capable of supercruise, except for the F-35. Now, I said earlier on that the Chengdu J-20 being able to supercruise puts it in a very selective group, along with only the F-20, and then there's another one, but you could argue the point. So the Su-57 is nominally capable of supercruise as well. The reason I said you could argue the point is that it hasn't really entered service in the same numbers as, say, the F-22. And there are many people who argue that despite having entered the competition later, the Chengdu J-20 is perhaps more further advanced along the track than the Sukhoi Su-57. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to here is the service entry dates down the bottom. The Su-57 one might be a bit dubious. Some sources say it entered service in 2019, some say 2020. Anyway, Doesn't really matter for the purposes of this. You can clearly see that the American F-22 was the first stealth fighter on the block and kind of ushered in a new era. It's a bit of a running joke that when NATO war games turn up and the various air forces do their little competitions, sometimes the Americans come out on top, sometimes other NATO powers come out on top. It varies. But regardless of what happens, the Americans always have a trump card they can pull. They can just bring out the F-22 and it kicks the stuffing out of everything. Because no one else has developed a stealth fighter. Except the Americans, of course, who've developed a second one. The F-35, which is now appearing in other countries. For example, the F-35B, I think it's the B variant, is operated these days by the Royal Navy. And among others. But what's interesting, I think, in this comparison is that the Su-57, F-22 and J-20 in this comparison can all supercruise. The F-35 can't. The first three are significantly heavier than the F-35. They are significantly larger than the F-35. And the Americans, with the first stealth fighter, which was also capable of supercruising, the F-22 there, have ceased production of the aircraft and are favouring instead the F-35, which can't supercruise. Now, I find that interesting because what it suggests to me... Now that... Okay, caveats. This is just my speculation. There are a good long list of reasons why this might be, and in interviews I have essentially seen it boil down to some degree of obsolescence. This thing entered service in 2005, and, you know, the Americans, this is the American Air Force, clearly are going to be of the view that some of the technology is now going to be a bit antiquated and outdated. Fine, fair enough. But it is notable that the F-22 has had production problems. It is an expensive aircraft to produce. It is an expensive aircraft to maintain. It is also a larger aircraft, and so on and so on. The point I'm trying to make is that the American Air Force is the only air force to have operated a supercruising stealth fighter, a non-supercruising stealth fighter, because no one else, other countries are barely even operating a stealth fighter. They're the only ones in that position, and they chose the latter to continue production. They prioritised ease of manufacture and things like that over the supercruising ability of the F-22. They are prioritising the F-35. I think that's very interesting, and what that suggests to me is that whilst being able to supercruise might sound great, it might also be a little bit overrated. Because if you think about it for a moment, what most military fighter jets do is travel around the vast majority of the time at subsonic speeds, and then if they find themselves in a sticky situation and they need to get out of Dodge, they punch the afterburner for a bit of supersonic flight for a short period of time. In most scenarios, do you need to be swanning around at supersonic speeds all the time? Do you need to have that ability? An interesting question, and I'll leave that for you to ponder. And that's where I'm going to leave this video. I hope you guys found that vaguely interesting. If you did, cool, grand. By all means, feel free to catch some other videos and or subscribe. I just wanted to throw this out there as something that was of interest. By the same token, if you've got comments on the subject, or if you look at anything and think, my goodness, I think he got that wrong, feel free to say in the comments. I do try and have a look at them and respond. And regardless, I wish you guys a very happy time. Enjoy doing whatever it is you're doing, and I will catch you in another video. Ciao, ciao.